So this morning, it's not so much a conversation. One of my mentors, and the theatre he runs is one of the most extraordinary theatres in the world, situated as it is in downtown of Astor Place, Lafayette Street, called the Public Theatre. Extraordinary place, a place that I've looked to and gloriously failed to either emulate or to replicate, but I will continue to do so in my final year. And a great and a gorgeous and a big-hearted man called Oskar Eustis has been artistic director there since 2005 and has an extraordinary remit and extraordinary success, including many transfers to Broadway, but that really is only a small portion of what he has managed to do. And as a colleague and as one of my mentors, we rarely speak, but we hug a lot, and we give ourselves bear hugs. And you see when you see him what a bear hug we can give. But I suppose rather than having a conversation with him this morning, I've asked him to talk to us about theatre, talk to us about rallying for theatre and rallying for change. And I think he'll let us in on a few of his challenges and his successes and his sense of mission in running what I think is one of the national theatres of the world, which is the Public Theatre in New York City. So please give a warm welcome to Mr. Oskar Eustis.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Abbey, to Fiach. Thanks for having me here. The only thing that I'm really qualified to talk about, and thus I think the way I've deserved my place at this podium, is my theatre. The Public Theatre, and I'm going to talk for a few minutes and then we'll talk. The Public Theatre was founded as the New York Shakespeare Festival in 1954, and it was founded on a very simple premise, which is that the culture belonged to everybody. And really that premise is part of the promise of America. America, as you know, is a land of contradictions, the United States. It was on the one hand founded as a burst of freedom, on the other hand it was a society that was a slave society, and it was founded on the genocide of the Native American peoples. And those tensions, is this a burst of freedom or is this a chance for individual aggrandizement, are the tensions that have underlain our country since its founding. And the Public Theatre the New York Shakespeare Festival, when it was founded, started with the idea that culture belonged to everybody, and therefore in the very simplest way, what we should be doing is free theater for the people. And it began as Shakespeare in the Park. And literally Joe Papp put Shakespeare on the back of flatbed trucks and drove it around to the parks of New York City and parked and performed Shakespeare for free for the people. And that was part of it, but it was also the cast of who was doing it in those early years. And this was entirely a volunteer enterprise at the time. George C. Scott, Colleen Dewhurst, Roscoe Lee Brown, James Earl Jones were the actors from the beginning. In the 1950s, this was a relatively radical idea. The casts were made up of a full racial diversity of the ethnicity that made up the United States. And we have a founding, really, battle of the Public Theatre, which is not perhaps quite as dramatic as the founding battle of the Abbey, but what is. And this was, after 4 years of doing this, Robert Moses, who was the most powerful man in the history of New York City. His title was Commissioner of the Parks, but that doesn't begin to lay bare his real power in the city. He controlled everything. Decided that Joe Papp couldn't do Shakespeare for free in the parks anymore, that he had to charge admission and split the money with the Parks Department because, he said, the audiences were wearing down the grass and there were costs to reseating. Now, we know enough about Robert Moses to know that that was not his actual objection to free Shakespeare in the Park. His actual objection is Bob Moses, despite being commissioner of the parks in a democracy, had a very clear sense of who should be allowed in his parks. There was a myth that African Americans didn't like cool water, so he lowered the temperature in all the city swimming pools by 10 degrees in the hopes that he could keep black people out. This was not a good man. But Bob Moses tried. Joe said no. Joe said, I won't charge. To even charge a nickel would actually violate the principle of what Shakespeare in the Park stands for. And so Moses refused to allow him a permit. Joe, who, remember, at this time he's a stage manager for CBS television during the day. He does Shakespeare in the Park as a hobby at night. It's a labor of love. takes on Robert Moses and insists that they will perform. This hits the front page of the New York Times. It becomes a battle that rages for 8 months. Thousands of people across New York City send in packets of grass seed to Robert Moses to suggest they have a way of reseeding the park. And finally, in the midst of this, Bob Moses red baits Joe Papp, and he announces to the press that this is a typical communist tactic and that Joe is a member of the Communist Party. Remember, this is 1958. The McCarthy period is still there. Whereupon Joe is fired from CBS television after being called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. So now he's an unemployed communist stage manager for CBS television, fighting the most powerful man in New York City, continues the fight, takes on another one with the help of his union. He goes after CBS television and tries to get his job back. And at the end of this, miraculously, he wins both struggles. The courts rule that CBS has to give him his job back. He quits immediately once he gets it back. And the courts rule that Bob Moses has behaved in an arbitrary and capricious manner, and that Joe should be allowed to perform free Shakespeare in the park. So he's triumphed. It's a glorious day for the New York Shakespeare Festival. It's also one of the markers of the end of McCarthyism in the United States. This is a beautiful legacy to have to live up to. This is a legacy of the little guy standing up to power and being able to do theater for the people. Over the years since then, the Public Theater has continued that mission. We became the Public in 1967 when Joe realized that in order to really be a democratic theater, he had to complete the democratic cycle, because there was a fantastic power to offering up Shakespeare for free to the people, for going and giving people the best writer in the history of the English language. Sorry. I know we could make some, here in Ireland, we could make some other contentions, but he was pretty good. For free to the people. But in order to complete, there's something inherently colonialist about that idea too. And in order to complete that cycle, what we needed to do was actually put the voice of the people on stage. And so Joe took over the old Astor Place Library in Lower Manhattan and the Lower East Side and turned it into the Public Theater in 1967. And in October of 1967, opened that theater indoors with his first production that he'd ever produced that wasn't Shakespeare, the world premiere of Hair, the musical. Not bad. And the review actually that Clive Barnes wrote in the New York Times was that it was a negative review. He said it was as if Joe had simply stepped outside of the theater and swept all the riffraff onto stage, which Joe blazoned in big letters in the lobby for years after that, because that was a perfect expression of his mission. And then he followed Hair with a string of other spectacular shows, including David Rabe's brilliant anti-war trilogy, which was one of the great pillars of the anti-war movement in the United States, and Tazake Shange's For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, a groundbreaking show, which he also moved to Broadway. And of course, Chorus Line, which started at the Public and both became a new way of developing musicals, the idea that out of verbatim workshops we can create what at that time was the most successful musical in American history. But also, interestingly enough, it's sort of the quintessential backstage musical. I mean, it's about theater, right? But it's also just about people who need a job. And it's a show that's specifically about the workers. It's about the chorus line. The star never appears in the show. So it's about the lives of working people who need a job. And it struck a chord in the mid-1970s in America that led it to run for 16 years on Broadway. So it's a great history, and the great, if you will, bilateral fulfillment of this mission of not only trying to bring the great art to the people, but actually giving the people voice and making them contribute to the canon of the literature. And the question, with that great democratic mission or premise, how do we fulfill that now? How do we execute that in our current climate? And I want to talk about just a couple of the ways that I, as steward of the public, have been trying to do that in the last 10 years. And then I'll be happy to talk to you guys about anything you'd like me to. And we defined, in a way, when I took the place over 10 years ago, we tried to refine what is just, this is not a publicity statement because nobody would ever go see a theater that had this kind of statement. We tried to refine a value statement for us. What were we trying to do? And the thing we came up with was that our basic job was try to dislodge theater from being a commodity and return it to being a set of relationships which is what it actually is. So rather than being a bauble, an expensive bauble that can be bought and sold, to try and actually revive the idea of what the theater is at its best is living exchange between human beings. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing we did was realize that we were a victim of our own success. Free Shakespeare in the Park, which was founded, so we give away 100,000 free tickets every summer to the greatest work that the American theater makes. Not only Shakespeare, but Meryl Streep, Al Pacino, the greatest actors we have, all for free in the park. It's fantastic. It's a wonderful thing, right? Well, it's become the hardest ticket to get in New York City. It's completely free if you can wait in line for 2 nights and sleep in the park. Now, needless to say, that narrows the demographic of who actually is able to come to Shakespeare in the Park. So we realized we were a victim of our own success. We were doing something great. Nobody wanted to stop doing Shakespeare at the Delacorte. But on the other hand, we needed to somehow revive how do we reach audiences who don't even know they need theater. So we revived the mobile unit in a slightly different form than it used to be. We don't have a flatbed truck anymore. Inspired by the brilliant Michelle Hensley, whose theater 10,000 Things in Minneapolis has been doing this work for 25 years, we created the mobile unit, small, completely flexible productions which can be performed anywhere. No lights, no sound effects, the only costumes what the actors are wearing. We perform in prisons, we perform in schools, we perform in community, halfway houses, doing Shakespeare to the most despised, neglected, and deprived audiences in New York. And what I can tell you is that once our artists went into the prisons, it's hard to get them to do anything else. Because what you experience in the prisons, forgive me, just a brief example. We were doing a production of Measure for Measure, Shakespeare's great play about the judicial system. We discovered it was about the judicial system when we performed in prisons. And in it, Isabel, the virginal nun Isabel, has gone to plead for her brother's life to Angelo, the head of the city of Venice, temporary head, who has sentenced her brother to death because he got his fiancée pregnant. So strict enforcement of the laws, he's sentenced to death for fornication. She pleads with him for her brother's life. He is so overcome with lust for her that he announces that he will save her brother's life if she will sleep with him. And if not, her brother dies. He leaves the stage, leaving the shattered Isabel alone. She turns out to the audience, which in this particular case was the women's prison on 34th Street in Manhattan, and she says, "To whom should I complain?" begins her soliloquy. And a woman in the audience immediately said, "The police!" And then we discovered something about the structure of Shakespearean soliloquy, because the next line, she just turned to that woman and said, "If I did report this, who would believe me?" And the woman said, "No one, girl." And you suddenly realize the soliloquies are call and response. They were, of course, what, we think the groundlings were respectively shushing each other? Of course that audience was interacting, of course that audience, and what you could feel in that moment, and what you could feel in all of our prison performances, is the need for narrative is as strong as the need for food, for shelter, for sex. It's a fundamental human drive, need, to feel that you are part of a story that is larger than yourself. A story that is not just a fable, but a story that is helping to explain yourself to yourself and to put yourself in an identifiable position within your society. That's a fundamental need we have. The mobile unit will never go away again now that it's back. We've created shows. I'm going to take just a second because I'm not allowed to speak now without talking about Hamilton, the musical that we opened last year. Right, it's hard to get tickets. But this show is also, on the other end of the spectrum, is a sign of the core principles of the Republic. Because what it is telling the story of the founding of the United States through the eyes of a founding father who was not an aristocratic Virginian, but who was a bastard immigrant orphan from the West Indies, Alexander Hamilton. He was also a New Yorker. And this story is told by a cast almost entirely of people of color. It's told in rap and hip hop, not because that's a nice style, but because the language of the streets is the language with which we can tell the founding of a democracy. The language of the, and really when you look at hip-hop is just iambic pentameter in the 21st century. Hip-hop, like iambic pentameter, is the voice of the people raised and ennobled by being made into verse. And so like iambic pentameter, it carries an extraordinary amount of information. And what you can feel watching the audience at Hamilton, watching this cast of color telling the story of the founding of America, is it allows progressive people to feel patriotic about America again. Because actually, those of us who have been so ashamed of so much of our country are reminded of the better angels of our nature, are reminded of the promise of inclusion that is the beautiful thing about the United States. And it's not a coincidence that it's the only great Broadway success of the last 20 years that has not a trace of irony in it. It's the most earnest, heartfelt piece on earth because it loves democracy, it loves inclusion. It's a great show, we'll bring it here. And finally, the thing I'm going to talk about, actually, I'm going to just mention our public works project, where what we try to do is, what we do is we base with community-based organizations, we work with them over the course of a year, and then we put on pageants at our Delacorte Theater in Central Park that mixes professional and non-professional actors. What better way of removing the taint of commodity from the theater than saying that you're not just going to watch this, you're going to make this with us. And the productions that my brilliant colleague Lear de Bessonet has created over the last 3 years, versions of Twelfth Night, The Odyssey, The Winter's Tale, have been extraordinary because we knew they'd be great social service, right? We knew it'd be thrilling for recently released prisoners or homeless young people or senior citizens from the poorest section of Brooklyn to appear on stage. We knew that would be lovely for them. What we didn't realize is that we could make great art by doing that. And the performances have been aesthetically as exciting as anything that we've ever done. The audience is euphoric over the course of those weekends. So this breaking down of the line between the professional and the amateur is actually also been a crucial part of what we've done the last few years, and I think a very successful part. We are working hard to deal with the gender parity issue, which is as much an issue for us as it is for anybody else. All of these issues are, we don't have answers to them, but struggling with them is the great joy of trying to have a theater that actually is of, by, and for the people, which is what the public theater is supposed to do. So thank you very much for having me here, and I'm happy to talk about anything else.